Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. Talking Kootenay Books takes the opportunity to talk to local writers and authors. We give them an opportunity to talk about their book and really explain what's unique about their new publication. Our guest today is Roger Berdusco. Roger's grown up in the Elk Valley, lives in Cranbrook right now. And Roger, you have a new book out that I found quite intriguing. It talks about a colorful character in the Kootenays. The book is The Legend of Lousy. Tell me about that book.
Well, thanks very much, first of all, Keith, for having me here. It's a pleasure. Yes, the book is called The Legend of Lousy, and Lousy was a very unique character that immigrated from Italy in the 50s and came to work in the Michelle area, initially in the underground mine area. And he later became a business person with a grocery store and so forth.
Okay, so obviously Lousy is a nickname. What was his real name?
Lousy's real name was Giorgetti Bertoia.
Okay, and how did you get to know him?
So my mother used to work for the Bertoia store. It was a little convenience store, an Italian grocery store, and she was a clerk there. And we became very good family friends, and my parents didn't do an awful lot of things in the outdoors, hunting and fishing and so forth, which I was very interested in even as a young person, and Giorgetti did a lot of that, and so we became connected in that way.
Okay. Before we get into the book that you've written and the character, I just want to talk about your background, Roger. Roger, you grew up in the Elk Valley, you were born there. Tell me what it was like to be a kid in the Elk Valley.
Well, that's an interesting question. I've been asked that a lot of times because the Michelle-Natal area had a very, very negative reputation for being very dirty from the coal dust and so forth. I was born in Michelle, and in fact specifically a place called Middletown between Natal and Michelle in 1951. And in the 60s, the Elk Valley became very, very busy with mining, with coal mining, and the town very quickly became quite dirty. And so it was a difficult time during what they called relocation. So they actually moved the entire community of Natal and relocated it to Sparwood. And it was very upsetting from, being a school child. And so forth, but it was a great place to live. I have absolutely wonderful memories. I mean,
how many people would have lived in Michelle and Natal, do you think?
It was less than 2,000 people that lived in Natal.
Right along the creek bank there?
On both sides, the actual Highway 3, the Crow's Nest highway went right through the middle of town, so the community was on both sides of the town.
You've probably stopped there, Roger, but there's a little pull-out where the old I think it was the Michelle Hotel was.
Correct.
If I'm not mistaken. And there's some beautiful plaques there that actually tell the story of the two towns. So if people are interested, they certainly could learn more about Michelle and Natal. That's
right, and in fact, that's a very good point. It's a real interesting and a quick read. And then, of course, the library and the museum in Sparwood has a tremendous collection of artifacts and stories and photographs of the Michelle-Natal history as well.
Okay.
Which went back to 1898, actually.
Yeah. So really the heart of the coal mining operation in the Elk Valley for many years. So let's talk about the book, The Legend of Lousy. You told us a little bit about who the character is. Now, when I read through the book, I found it very humorous. This gentleman seemed to have a knack for getting into all kinds of scrapes and trouble and so forth. And I'm assuming that you didn't have to embellish anything because it seemed like his adventures were pretty real.
No, I certainly did not have to embellish anything, and the stories kind of wrote themselves. Most of the stories in the book were my personal experiences. There were a number in there that were related to me by others, but again, the majority were my personal experiences. So it was a pleasure to put them together. That's for sure.
Yeah. So he was definitely a larger-than-life character. Can you just tell me maybe a couple of the more humorous stories that you encountered when you were putting the book together?
Well, you know, I had the intention of collecting these stories literally for decades, and I'd known Lousy or Giorgetti for a long, long time, and I guess I hadn't really recognized just how unique he was. He was just a good friend of mine, and then I realized after a period of time that these stories were really quite humorous, and quite often we'd get together with friends and we'd end up relating stories, and you know, found them to be quite humorous, and I decided to put a collection of them together. And I actually spoke to a number of friends and pulled together their stories and made notes, and so I'm going back probably 20 years, you know, pulling together the bits and pieces of stories before I actually put pen to paper and started the book.
Sure. What motivated you to write the book? Like, you are obviously a friend. The stories are unique, and you know, many of us encounter unique individuals, but not all of us write about it. What motivated you to write them down?
Well, sadly, my good friend Giorgetti passed away about 10 years ago, and I realized that between myself and all his other friends, that eventually there would come a time when, you know, people wouldn't remember him. The stories would fade, and they'd be lost to time. Mm-hmm. And so I felt it was really important to put them together before that happened.
So do you feel that the book is somewhat of a tribute to Giorgetti?
Oh, I personally think it is, and I like to believe that his children, he has 2 children that are living, and I'm quite certain that they feel the same way. It is a tribute, and the kind of feedback I've had from the community, and I've had dozens and dozens of emails and phone calls and letters saying, you know, good for you. You know, I've laughed all the way through the book. I remembered him as a character. What a wonderful idea that you pulled that together so that those stories aren't lost. So that alone made me feel like the effort was worthwhile.
And talking about the effort, how long did it take you to put the book together and get it published and so forth?
Yeah, it was probably the biggest part of a year when I actually penned the rough outline, created a couple dozen of the stories, and then began the process of editing and cleaning and either adding or deleting with input from others.
I see.
So a little over a year, but the pieces of it go back, you know, decades.
Right. So you've collected a lot of information. I always think it's valuable to sort of document these colorful characters that we have in the Kootenays. Like you said, if we don't, they often slip away and people forget about them. Yeah. And you know, I was reading through one of the stories, and I think it was when Giorgetti Lousy was painting the house. Can you just tell me a little bit about that story?
I do remember that one like it was yesterday. It was actually at Giorgetti's cabin. There was a group of men, there was 4 or 5 of them that jointly owned a cabin at a place called Iron Creek or Bingay Creek in the Elk Valley. It was a log cabin. In fact, it was a turn of the century, last century cabin that they had upgraded and maintained very nicely, and it was their getaway. And they spent many you know, days and weeks there fishing and hunting and just relaxing in the outdoors. It's a very remote cabin. And on this occasion, my friend Ken and I were fishing in the upper Elk Valley, and we decided to stop in and pay him a visit because we saw his vehicle parked near the cabin. And so we knew that he would be there, or at least not very far away. So we pulled up to the cabin, and my usual greeting was, "Hello, the cabin. Anybody here?" And there was no answer. And so I moved forward again. I looked around outside. He wasn't there. And came to the door and I said, "Hello, the cabin." And I looked in through the door, and sure enough, he was there. He just couldn't hear us. He was inside. And there he was in the middle of this log cabin, and he was whitewashing. The entire inside of the cabin was white just to brighten it up. And he was standing on a little chair and with no clothes on other than his little short underwear. And he was reaching up and with this big brush and painting the ceiling. And he was absolutely dripping with paint. It was all over him, his legs and his hair and everywhere. And I said to him, "What are you doing?" And he goes, "Oh," he says, "you're here." He says, "I had to paint the cabin," he said. And I said, "Well, why are you painting your cabin with no clothes on?" And he said, "Well, I didn't want to get paint on him." And so that's the kind of thing where, to me, it was, he certainly didn't see any humor in it. He didn't think that was funny at all. He thought it was a practical way to
Well,
not,
when you stop
not get
about it, I
clothes.
guess it's one way not to get paint on your clothes, right?
Exactly, and we thought it was hilarious, but
So
he
that's
just,
sort of indicative of the kind of character he was. I love the story about the large snowfall in Sparwood, and what was his unique way of getting rid of that snow?
So there was another story in the book that I think most people would find quite humorous, and it's absolutely true. The neighbor recalled it. I wasn't there, but the neighbor told me about this story where Giorgetti was a very kind person, very giving, very generous with his time and anything else that he had from his garden or whatever. And he used to snowblow, clean the sidewalks and driveways of the neighbors because he had a nice big snowblower. And one day, it was a huge snowfall. It was in the 70s, I believe, and we used to get huge snowfalls in Sparwood. And my friend was looking out the window and he could hear the snowblower, but he didn't see the driveway cleaned, and he didn't see Giorgetti's next door cleaned either, and he thought it was odd. But he went back to what he was doing, and a while later he came out again and he still could hear the snow machine working, but still there was nothing in his driveway cleaned. And so he thought, there's something odd. So he went outside and he could hear a snowblower going all right. And he looked around, but he thought it seemed odd. He said the noise seemed to be coming from higher than the ground level. And he looked up, and sure enough, the snowblower, somehow Giorgetti had got the snowblower up onto his roof. And it was a relatively steep roof, nothing hugely steep, but certainly a peaked roof. And he was going up and down with his snowblower on the roof, clearing the snow. And every once in a while, the snowblower would dig into the shingles, and a big black patch would come out through the snowblower chute. And so now he said, well, at least I've solved the question, the mystery of where the noise was coming from. How he got it up there, we still don't know. And when I spoke to him many months later, he had to get his roof repaired because he had done so much damage to it. But he didn't really see a problem. I mean, he just shrugged it off as something that he felt he had to do. It was a smart thing to do.
Well, probably at the time it did. He didn't think about the consequences, right?
I don't think he did. No, he had a difficult time with consequences of what he thought were appropriate things to do.
Yeah. So I just want to go back and explore a little bit about the Elk Valley. Roger, you said you were born there in 1951. What changes have you seen in the Elk Valley?
Well, of course, there's huge changes. Of course, Michelle and Natal no longer exist. The valley is now the only remnant that's in the lower valley where the town was a warehouse, which is run and operated by Tech, and the population that was in Michelle and Natal were relocated to Sparwood, and some people chose at that time to move further away as well into Fernie and other places. So that is a huge change, of course. Sparwood was a much more modern, a very clean community, and still is today. A beautiful community, and very modern and so forth. So, of course, the mainstay from an employment and industry point of view is still coal mining. Tech being the coal miner in the area with their main offices in Sparwood.
Well, you worked there for many years. You worked at Kaiser Coal and so forth. So you would have seen the creation and birth of like Elkford, right?
I did, and in fact, I was working with Kaiser Resources after graduating from university. I worked there from 1974 until 78, and then I took a position with Fording Coal Limited in Elkford, and Fording had just developed the community of Elkford. It was only a few years old in those days, and that's where my wife and our family, we moved to Elkford, and were there for 28 years before the merging of Fording and Teck and so forth eventually became one company now called Teck, and
Right.
their headquarters are in Calgary.
Right. So there's been massive changes, as you mentioned, in the Elk Valley, all surrounding the coal industry and so forth. And it seemed like your character in the book was closely connected to what was going on in the community. He seemed to be involved in a lot of things.
He was.
Was that by design or by accident?
I think Giorgetti came, like most immigrants to Canada, with virtually, no education, came as a laborer and took the first job that he was able to get, and that was a laborer working underground in the coal mines. And then when he saw the opportunity, he told me many times how he disliked underground coal mining, and he saw an opportunity to go into business for himself, and there was a small grocery store that was the people that owned it were retiring, and so he purchased that store and expanded it and ran it for many years as his company and his business. And his wife and again my mother worked there as well. So, and then when the relocation happened from Michel Natal to Sparwood, he didn't rebuild his business in Sparwood. He chose then to go to work for the coal company. In those days it was Kaiser Resources, and he ended up working as a utility person in the carpentry area in the process plant, and he retired from that position. So, but he was a big part of the community in many, many ways. He did everything. He curled, and he did virtually every sport that you can think of. He was an ice maker in the curling rink, and he looked after a lot of things like that. And
despite all his bumbling and the adventures and misadventures he got into, he seemed to be a very generous person.
He was incredibly generous. Anybody who would ever need anything, or if there was some sort of charitable drive going on, he was always there. He always contributed in many, many ways, and he also helped people out. In those days, a lot of people didn't have their own vehicles, and he would deliver groceries, sometimes even 10 miles up the Elk Valley. He would deliver, very small grocery order, some bread and vegetables and that sort of thing, and he just did it because of his generous nature. I mean, he was a businessman as well, but he just had this very generous side to him. And it's the same with his garden. He had a huge garden in his yard, and he was always giving away his vegetables, his tomatoes and his carrots and everything else to anybody who would come by.
So Roger, do you feel that your life was enriched by knowing this character?
That's a perfect word. Yes, it certainly was. He gave me opportunities that I maybe wouldn't never have had. I certainly wouldn't have had them with my parents, because they weren't people that hunted or fished or enjoyed the outdoors. They didn't have a truck, and they just didn't do that. And he provided me those opportunities. He took me under his wing, and he took me out on my first snowmobile ride, and brought me fishing for one of the first times ever. All those kinds of things, and hunting, and those are things that became incredibly important to me, and they are to me to this day. So absolutely, he did enrich my life in a big way.
Oh, good. Just talking specifically about the book and the production of it, how did that all go together? I know you self-published. Was that an easy process? Was it challenging? How did that all work?
Well, I wouldn't say it was easy. I was incredibly fortunate that my son is, is a graphic designer. My daughter is a librarian and a report writer. So I've had, really, really good resources to lean on, to look for, and review drafts, to edit my, first things that I put onto paper. And certainly there were quite a few different versions that we went to, and deciding on, the format and what the intention of the book would be, how it would come across to the family, to the Victoria family, was incredibly important to us. We wanted to ensure that it was tasteful and it didn't make him look, foolish in any way. We wanted to ensure that it just captured some really positive and some good things. And it was a lot of work, I will say that, but it was, I think I've said, it was a labor of love for me, for sure. I enjoyed doing it, but I was fortunate that I had good support from my wife as well, and all my children, and then, pulling it together.
Sure. Let me ask you specifically, Roger, about the illustrations. So the illustrations throughout the book are very colorful, sort of capture the essence of the story. How did that all come about?
That's a really good question too, and we were struggling trying to, initially we thought we'd be able to use family photographs, the ones that I had and others, and they just weren't cutting it. They were just, and so it was my son who said, we need to get a caricature based on a good photograph of Giorgetti. And then he said, and because he works in that business, he said, we can get online, we can put those, if you make some sketches of what you want to portray, along with the caricature from the photograph, we'll have people, we'll solicit people to do this work for us. And neither one of us knew exactly how that was going to turn out, but we took a couple of examples, and Dan put them out on a request for proposal online, and got some really, really incredible artists coming back and making proposals to us, and then we chose the best ones, and the ones that obviously were cost effective for us as well. And that's the way that went. But I think it made a huge difference to the book, and most everyone that reads the book says the pictures pull it together. The picture, if it was just words, it would be a little bit hard to kind of understand.
Well, it certainly does enhance the story, and they're well illustrated and reflect what's going on. So there's a bit of humor even in the illustrations as well. So what do you think about this book publishing business? Is there another one in the plans?
Actually, I haven't had a chance to talk to you about this, Keith, but just about a week ago, I decided to write a second book, and something I had started many years ago, and I put it to the side, and I've decided that I want to do this now. I'm feeling good about the success of this particular book, and the book is called, will likely be called something like La Cucina di Rosina, which means Rosina's kitchen, and Rosina is my mum. My mum was known as in the community in the Elk Valley as an incredibly talented cook and baker, and when she passed away a few years ago, she lived to almost 100 years old, and when she passed away, I've ended up with all of her recipes, and they're just an absolute treasure, and I really want to try to capture them. So I'm structuring a book a little bit with a brief introduction about her and her journey coming from Italy and so forth, and being a young person in the war in Europe, and grade 3 education, and coming to Canada and working very hard and doing very well for herself. And so I do want to capture that's a bit of that story, but importantly also I want to capture the recipes, so that other people can enjoy, homemade pasta and all the various Italian recipes.
Yeah, sounds intriguing. So congratulations on that effort as well. We look forward to that. I would assume that, again, maybe it gives you an opportunity not only to talk about your family, but maybe a little bit about the Elk Valley as well.
Well, for sure. I think there is a history there that perhaps a lot of people don't know about, and it would be nice to have it captured in a book, and perhaps it can rest in the libraries in Sparwood and so forth. And I think it would be important. And one thing I didn't say earlier, Keith, is that my initiative has never been a financial one. I'm not going to make any money on the book that I wrote or the one that's coming. My intent was to capture those stories so they weren't lost. And in fact, the proceeds from the first book, The Legend of Lousy, are being shared by the senior citizens. It's called the Sparwood Old Age Pensioners Club, and also the Sparwood Public Library. So they're the ones that share the profits and from the book.
Well, good for you, Roger. That's very generous of you, and sort of giving back to the community. Yeah.
That was certainly the intention as well.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to your new project as well, and congratulations on The Legend of Lousy. Just tell me before we wrap up, what's been the reaction?
The reaction to me was shocking. I guess I was wondering if anybody would even really bother picking it up. I just advertised it on my Facebook page, and the reaction was amazing. I mean, we sold hundreds of copies very, very quickly, and almost instantly I got back nothing but positive reactions from people that said, good for you, you've captured a very unique character. It brought back good memories of growing up and of living in Michel, Natal, and very encouraging. And in fact, there are some people who would like me to write, because they have stories that I wasn't aware of about Giorgetti. They'd like me to write a sequel because there's so many other stories that I wasn't aware of. But,
so it could be The Legend of Lousy too.
It could. There's enough material to do that. I'm not sure that we're going to go down that road, but that possibility, I guess, always exists.
Good. Well, thanks, Roger. Appreciate you being the guest today on Talking Kootenay Books. So this has been Talking Kootenay Books. The author is Roger Berdusco. The name of his book is The Legend of Lousy, and my name is Keith Powell, and I'm your host.